The sun rose over Tenochtitlan, casting golden light across the great city of the Mexica. Temples stood tall, markets bustled, and the lake shimmered with canoes. But beneath the surface of daily life, tension brewed. A strange fleet had arrived on the shores of the Gulf of Mexico, carrying men with pale skin, beards, and weapons unlike any seen before. They called themselves Spaniards, led by a man named Hernán Cortés. Moctezuma, the mighty ruler of the Mexica, faced a choice. Would he welcome them as gods, as some believed, or see them as invaders? The decision he made would shape the fate of an empire. Moctezuma's encounter with Cortés would not only change his own life, but also mark the beginning of the end for the Mexica civilization. Betrayal, fear, and collapse followed in quick succession. How did it all happen? Why did Moctezuma, a ruler of immense power, fall so quickly? The story of his death is not just one of violence and conquest, but of choices, misunderstandings, and the clash of two worlds. Moctezuma II, also known as Moctezuma Xochitl, was born into a world of power and ritual. He was the nephew of the great emperor Ahuitzotl and the grandson of Moctezuma I, both rulers who expanded the Mexica Empire to its greatest height. From a young age, Moctezuma was trained in warfare, diplomacy, and religious rites. He became a skilled warrior and a devout follower of the gods, especially Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun. His rise to power came in 1502 when he was chosen as Tlatoani, the supreme ruler of Tenochtitlan, by the city's council of nobles. Under his rule, the Mexica Empire stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean, dominating much of Mesoamerica through a network of tribute and military strength. The Mexica, often mistakenly called Aztecs by later historians, built their empire through a combination of conquest and strategic alliances. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, was a marvel of engineering, built on an island in Lake Texcoco. It had grand temples, bustling markets, and a complex system of canals and causeways. The Mexica believed that their empire was chosen by the gods, and their rulers were seen as semi-divine figures. Moctezuma, in particular, was known for his deep religious devotion and his strict rule. He expanded the great temple of the Templo Mayor, increased the number of human sacrifices to appease the gods, and imposed harsh laws to maintain order. However, his reign was not without unrest. Some of the conquered peoples resented Mexica rule, and whispers of rebellion stirred in the outer provinces. Beyond the borders of the empire, the Mexica faced threats from rival city-states, particularly the Tlaxcalans and the Tarascans, who resisted Mexica dominance. The empire relied on a system of tribute, where conquered cities sent goods, food, and captives for sacrifice to Tenochtitlan. This system worked well when the Mexica were strong, but if their power weakened, the tribute system could collapse. Moctezuma understood this and ruled with an iron hand, ensuring that no city could challenge the empire's authority. Yet, despite his efforts, omens and prophecies troubled him. Strange signs had appeared in the sky, and reports of strange beings arriving from the east filled him with unease. When the Spaniards arrived, Moctezuma was already on edge, unsure whether they were gods or harbingers of doom. In February 1519, Hernán Cortés and his fleet of 11 ships made landfall on the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. The Spaniards, numbering around 500 men, were hardened veterans of previous conquests in the Caribbean. They carried steel swords, arquebuses, and cannons, weapons far superior to the obsidian-edged macahuitl swords and wooden spears of the native peoples. Cortés, a skilled and ambitious soldier, had been granted permission by the governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, to explore the mainland. However, he soon broke from Velázquez's authority, determined to carve his own legacy in the New World. Cortés's first encounters with the indigenous peoples of the Yucatan were marked by violence and confusion. The Spaniards clashed with the Maya at the town of Patanchan, where they seized supplies and prisoners. Among these prisoners was a woman named Malintzin, later known as La Malinche. She would become one of the most crucial figures in the conquest, serving as Cortés's interpreter and advisor. Fluent in both Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica, and Mayan, she helped bridge the vast cultural and linguistic gap between the Spaniards and the native peoples. As Cortés moved inland, he learned of the powerful empire ruled by Moctezuma. The tales of Tenochtitlan's wealth and grandeur filled the Spaniards with awe and ambition. Cortés knew that if he could reach the heart of the Mexica Empire, he might gain control of an immense treasure. He also understood that the Mexica were not universally loved. Many of the conquered peoples resented their rule. Cortés saw an opportunity to exploit these divisions, forging alliances with groups such as the Totonacs and later the Teutonchalans, who saw the Spaniards as potential liberators. By the time Cortés reached the outskirts of the Mexica Empire, he had gathered a force of thousands of native warriors, vastly outnumbering his Spanish troops. Yet, despite their numbers, the alliance remained fragile. The Spaniards were outsiders, their motives unclear, and their presence threatened to upend the delicate balance of power in Mesoamerica. The stage was set for a meeting that would alter the course of history, the first encounter between Moctezuma and Cortés. Moctezuma's decision to receive Cortés in Tenochtitlan was a fateful one. The Mexica ruler had received reports of the Spaniards' arrival on the coast, and strange omens had filled him with dread. For years, he had feared the return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god who was said to come from the east. Some believed the Spaniards might be divine messengers, and Moctezuma, deeply religious, hesitated to act against them. He sent gifts of gold and turquoise, hoping to appease them, but the Spaniards only pushed forward. Faced with growing pressure from his advisors and the uncertainty of the situation, Moctezuma decided to invite Cortés into the capital. On November 8, 1519, the two leaders met at the city's edge. Moctezuma, dressed in royal regalia, stepped forward to greet Cortés, offering gifts of gold and precious feathers. The Mexica ruler, according to some accounts, may have believed Cortés to be Quetzalcoatl or a representative of the gods. Others argue that he was attempting to assert dominance through ritualized diplomacy, treating the Spaniards as guests rather than conquerors. Whatever his true thoughts, Moctezuma allowed the Spaniards and their native allies to enter Tenochtitlan unopposed. Cortés, ever the strategist, seized the moment. He knew that his small force was vastly outnumbered, and he needed to secure his position quickly. That night, he took a bold step. He placed Moctezuma under house arrest. Claiming that the emperor had been tricked by his own advisors, Cortés presented himself as a protector of Moctezuma's rule. The Mexica ruler, now a captive in his own palace, was forced to obey the Spaniards. The city remained calm, but tensions simmered beneath the surface. Moctezuma's capture did not bring the swift control Cortés had hoped for. Instead, it deepened the fractures within Tenochtitlan. Though Moctezuma still spoke as the ruler, his authority had been undermined. The Mexican nobility, long accustomed to his command, now questioned his judgment. Why had he allowed these foreign invaders into the heart of their empire? Why did he not resist? Some whispered that he had been bewitched, that the Spaniards had cast a spell upon him. Others believed he had truly lost his mind, that the gods had abandoned him. Beyond the palace walls, the city's people grew restless. The Spaniards, with their steel weapons and foreign ways, were an unsettling presence. They demanded tribute, occupied temples, and treated the Mexica as subjects rather than allies. The Mexica warriors, once the feared enforcers of the empire, found themselves disarmed and powerless. Yet despite their anger, open rebellion did not come immediately. The Mexica were a disciplined people, and for now they obeyed the commands of their captive ruler. But not all remained silent. In the outer provinces, resentment against Mexica rule flared into open defiance. The Totonacs, once allies of the Spaniards, began to question their loyalty. The Tlaxcalans, who had fought beside Cortés, feared that the Spaniards would not honor their agreements. Even within the Mexican ranks, whispers of resistance spread. Some warriors believed that Moctezuma had failed his people, that he had lost the favor of the gods. They looked to other leaders, to those who might rise and reclaim their city. The tension in Tenochtitlan grew with each passing day. The Mexica were not a people accustomed to weakness, and the sight of their emperor held captive by a handful of foreigners was a wound that could not heal. The city was a powder keg, and soon the smallest spark would set it ablaze. The breaking point came in May 1520, when Cortés was forced to leave Tenochtitlan. Word had reached him that another Spanish force, sent by the governor of Cuba, had landed on the coast with orders to arrest him. Fearful of losing his command, Cortés took a portion of his men and marched to confront this new threat. Before leaving, he placed his trusted lieutenant Pedro Alvarado in charge of the garrison in Tenochtitlan. It was a decision that would prove disastrous. With Cortés gone, the tensions in the city reached a boiling point. The Mexica were growing increasingly resentful of the Spaniards' presence, and the absence of their leader only heightened their frustration. Alvarado, wary of a potential uprising, decided to act first. He believed that the Mexican nobles were planning an attack and sought to eliminate the threat before it could materialize. On the day of the festival of Toxocat, a sacred ceremony honoring the god Tezcatlipoca, Alvarado ordered his men to strike. As the Mexican nobles gathered in the courtyard of the great temple, unarmed and adorned in ceremonial regalia, the Spaniards attacked. Swords slashed through the crowd, and blood stained the temple steps. The Mexica, caught off guard and defenseless, were slaughtered in large numbers. The massacre sent shockwaves through the city. The Mexica had tolerated the Spaniards' presence under Moctezuma's rule, but now they saw them as nothing more than brutal oppressors. The fragile peace shattered, and the city erupted into chaos.
When Cortés returned to Tenochtitlan, he found a city on the brink of war. The Mexica had turned against their captive emperor, blaming him for allowing the Spaniards to commit such atrocities. Moctezuma, once a figure of divine authority, was now seen as a traitor. The Mexica nobles turned to his younger brother, Cuitlahuac, as a new leader. The Spaniards, realizing their position was no longer secure, prepared for battle. The stage was set for the final confrontation that would decide the fate of Tenochtitlan. With the city in chaos, Moctezuma's position became increasingly precarious. The Mexica nobles, once his most loyal supporters, now viewed him as a collaborator with the Spaniards. The massacre at the Great Temple had shattered whatever authority he had left. The people no longer saw him as the chosen ruler of Tenochtitlan, but as a man who had allowed foreigners to desecrate their most sacred site. His voice, once obeyed without question, now carried no weight. Fearing for their safety, the Spaniards kept Moctezuma under tight watch. They believed that if they could still present him as their ally, they might prevent a full-scale uprising. But the Mexica had already chosen a new leader, Cuitlahuac, Moctezuma's younger brother. The nobles gathered in secret, declaring Cuitlahuac the new Tlatoani. The transition was swift, and Moctezuma, once the supreme ruler of an empire, was now a man without a throne. Desperate to regain control, the Spaniards forced Moctezuma to address the people from the palace balcony. They hoped that his words would calm the crowds and prevent open war. But the sight of their emperor, held captive by the very men who had defiled their temples, only deepened the fury of the Mexica. Instead of obeying, The people hurled insults and stones at him. Some called him a coward, others spat at his name. Moctezuma, once revered as a god king, was now a broken man. The final blow came when a stone struck him in the head. The injury was severe, but the Spaniards did not allow a Mexican healer to treat him. Whether this was out of fear or indifference remains unclear. Some accounts claim that the Spaniards killed him themselves, fearing that he might turn against them. Others argue that he died from his wounds, abandoned by both his people and his captors. Whatever the truth, Moctezuma's death marked the end of an era. The Mexica Empire, once mighty and feared, was now leaderless, and the path to its destruction lay open. Moctezuma's death did not bring peace, it brought war. With the emperor gone, the Mexica turned to Cuitlahuac, who wasted no time in organizing resistance. The Spaniards, trapped in the heart of Tenochtitlan, found themselves surrounded by an angry and determined people. The city's warriors, once hesitant to act, now saw the invaders as enemies to be driven out. The streets of Tenochtitlan became battlegrounds, and the Spaniards fought desperately to survive. Cortés knew that remaining in the city was a death sentence. He ordered a retreat, but the Mexica had cut the causeways leading out of the island capital. On the night of June 30th, 1520, the Spaniards and their native allies attempted to flee under cover of darkness. The Mexican warriors, however, had anticipated the move. As the Spaniards crossed the causeways, they were ambushed. The battle became a massacre. Many Spaniards drowned in the lake, weighed down by their armor and stolen gold. Others were captured and later sacrificed at the Great Temple. Of the thousands who had entered Tenochtitlan, only a fraction escaped. This night became known as La Noche Triste, the Sad Night. Though the Spaniards had suffered a devastating defeat, Cortés was not finished. He regrouped in Tlaxcala, where he found allies eager to see the Mexica overthrown. He also gathered reinforcements from the Caribbean. With a new army and a strategy of siege warfare, he returned to Tenochtitlan in May 1521. This time, he would not enter the city. He would starve it into submission. The Spaniards and their allies blockaded the city, cutting off food and supplies. They also introduced smallpox, a disease that ravaged the Mexican population. With famine and disease weakening the defenders, the end was near. After months of brutal fighting, Tenochtitlan fell on August 13, 1521. The once great city lay in ruins, its temples burned, its people dead or enslaved. The Mexica Empire, which had ruled Mesoamerica for over a century, was no more. The Spaniards had won, but the cost had been immense. The fall of Tenochtitlan marked the end of an era and the beginning of Spanish rule in Mexico. With the city in ruins, the Spaniards set about reshaping the land in their own image. Cortés declared the destruction of the city a victory for Spain and began the process of rebuilding. The grand temples of the Mexica were torn down, and in their place, Christian churches rose. The Templo Mayor, once the heart of Mexican worship, was dismantled, its stones repurposed for the construction of a cathedral. The lake that had once cradled the island city was drained over time, transforming the landscape into something more familiar to the European eye. The surviving Mexica were forced into submission. Many were slaved, their labor used to construct the new colonial capital, Mexico City. The Spanish imposed their language, their laws, and their religion upon the native population. Missionaries arrived in droves, seeking to convert the people to Christianity. The old gods were replaced by saints, and the rituals of the Mexica were outlawed. Yet despite the Spaniards' efforts, elements of the old world endured. The Nahuatl language survived, and many indigenous traditions found new forms within the framework of Catholicism. Politically, the conquest reshaped the entire region. The once dominant Mexica were replaced by a new ruling class of Spanish elites. The encomienda system was established, granting Spanish settlers control over native labor and tribute. This system, though brutal, allowed the Spanish to maintain power with relatively few troops. The former allies of the Spaniards, such as the Tlaxcalans, were granted privileges in exchange for their loyalty, but they too found themselves under Spanish rule. The fall of the Mexica Empire was not just the end of a single kingdom, it was the beginning of a new era for all of Mesoamerica. The Spanish conquest set the stage for centuries of colonial rule, during which the indigenous peoples of Mexico would struggle to preserve their identity in the face of overwhelming change. While the Spaniards' weapons and alliances played a crucial role in the conquest, an even deadlier force arrived with them: disease. Smallpox, brought by the Europeans, spread rapidly through the densely populated city of Tenochtitlan. The Mexica had never encountered this disease before, and their bodies had no immunity to it. Within weeks, thousands fell ill. Victims suffered from high fevers, severe pain, and pus-filled sores that covered their bodies. Those who survived were often left scarred for life. The impact of smallpox was devastating. Entire families were wiped out, and the city's population dwindled. The disease did not discriminate. It struck warriors, priests, nobles, and commoners alike. Even the new emperor, Cuitlahuac, was not spared. He fell ill and died within weeks of contracting the disease, leaving the Mexica without strong leadership at a critical moment. The loss of so many people weakened the city's ability to resist the Spanish siege. Farmers could no longer tend their fields, warriors were too sick to fight, and the once disciplined Mexica military crumbled. The Spaniards, though not immune to disease, had some exposure to smallpox and other European illnesses. Some had already survived outbreaks in their homeland, giving them a better chance of survival. The Mexica, however, had no such protection. The disease spread faster than the Spanish army, striking fear into those who remained. Some believed the gods had turned against them, punishing them for their failure to stop the invaders. Smallpox did not just weaken the Mexica, it also shattered their morale. The Spaniards, seeing the devastation, used it to their advantage. They spread rumors that the disease was a sign of divine favor, that the Christian God was stronger than the Mexica gods. Whether by design or coincidence, the timing of the outbreak sealed the fate of Tenochtitlan. By the time the city fell, the disease had already done much of the Spaniards' work for them. Beyond weapons and disease, the Spaniards wielded another powerful tool: psychological warfare. From the moment they arrived in Mesoamerica, Cortés and his men understood that fear could be as effective as steel. They used their horses, unknown to the native peoples, to create a sense of invincibility. The sight of a mounted rider, clad in armor and wielding a sword, was terrifying to those who had never seen such a sight. The Mexica, believing that man and horse were a single being, saw the Spaniards as supernatural warriors. Cortés also manipulated symbols and rituals to his advantage. He understood the importance of divine authority in Mexica society and used it to his benefit. When he first arrived in Tenochtitlan, he did not act like a conqueror. He acted like a guest, accepting Moctezuma's gifts and playing into the belief that he might be a god. By allowing Moctezuma to believe he was a divine messenger, Cortés gained time to secure his position. Once he had the emperor in his grasp, he used Moctezuma's authority to control the city, forcing him to issue orders that kept the Mexica from rising up. Even after Moctezuma's death, the Spaniards continued to use psychological tactics. They displayed their weapons openly, firing cannons and arquebuses in public to shock and intimidate the local population. They also used their alliances with rival city-states to spread fear. The Tlaxcalans, who had suffered under Mexica rule, were encouraged to take revenge, and their brutal actions served as a warning to those who might resist Spanish authority. Perhaps the most chilling form of psychological warfare was the public execution of Mexica leaders. The Spaniards made examples of those who opposed them, hanging or burning them in front of large crowds. These displays were meant to break the will of the Mexica people, to show that resistance was futile. The message was clear. The Spaniards were not just invaders, they were an unstoppable force. With Moctezuma dead and Tenochtitlan in ruins, his family faced an uncertain future. Some of his children were taken by the Spaniards, given Spanish names, and raised in the Catholic faith. His daughter, Tekuchpotzin, was among the most notable. She was married off to several high-ranking Spaniards, including Alonso de Grado and Juan Cano, as a symbol of the new order.
Through these marriages, she bore children who would later claim noble status in colonial Mexico. Her life, like that of many indigenous nobles, was one of survival in a world that had been turned upside down.
Other members of Moctezuma's family were not so fortunate. Some were executed, others enslaved, and many simply disappeared in the chaos of the conquest. The Mexica nobility, once the ruling class of a vast empire, found themselves stripped of power. Their lands were taken, their titles erased, and their influence reduced to a mere shadow of what it had been. The Spaniards, however, did not entirely erase Moctezuma from history. In later years, some of his descendants were granted noble status by the Spanish crown, recognizing their royal lineage. These descendants, known as the Counts of Moctezuma, would hold titles in Spain and Mexico for centuries. Yet Moctezuma's legacy remained a subject of debate. To the Mexica, he was a ruler who had failed to protect his people, a man who had allowed the Spaniards to walk into Tenochtitlan unchallenged. To the Spaniards, he was either a misguided leader or a tyrant who had deserved his fate. Historians have long debated his role in the conquest. Was he a victim of circumstance caught between prophecy and politics? Or had he made fatal mistakes that led to the fall of his empire? Regardless of the answer, his name would echo through history, a symbol of the clash between two worlds. The fall of the Mexica Empire marks not only a political and military upheaval, but also a profound cultural and religious transformation. The Spaniards, determined to erase the old ways, launched a campaign to convert the indigenous population to Christianity. Missionaries, particularly Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits, arrived in large numbers, establishing missions and schools throughout the former empire. They sought to replace the worship of Huitzilopochtli, Tlaloc, and the other Mexica gods with the veneration of saints and the Virgin Mary. The Templo Mayor, once the center of Mexica religious life, was dismantled, and its stones were used to build the first Catholic cathedral in Mexico City. The conversion process was not always forced, but it was relentless. The Spaniards used both persuasion and coercion, offering incentives for those who embraced Christianity, while punishing those who clung to their traditional beliefs. Indigenous temples were destroyed, and idols were burned. The Mexica, whose religion was deeply intertwined with their identity, found themselves caught between survival and resistance. Some accepted baptism to avoid persecution, while others practiced their old faiths in secret, blending Catholic rituals with native traditions. This fusion gave rise to new forms of worship, such as the veneration of the Virgin of Guadalupe, a figure who combined elements of the Mexica mother goddess Tenantzin with the Catholic Virgin Mary. Language, too, became a battleground. Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica, was widely spoken across Mesoamerica, but the Spaniards sought to impose Spanish as the dominant tongue. Schools were established to teach indigenous children in Spanish, and the use of Nahuatl in official matters was gradually restricted. Yet Nahuatl did not disappear. It survived in rural communities and influenced the Spanish spoken in Mexico, contributing words such as chocolate, tomato, and coyote to the Spanish and later English lexicon. Art and literature also underwent a transformation. The vibrant murals and codices of the Mexica were replaced by Christian iconography, but indigenous artists continued to create, often blending European styles with native symbolism. The Codex Mendoza, commissioned by Spanish authorities, documented the history of the Mexica Empire through a mix of indigenous and European artistic traditions. This blending of cultures, though imposed through conquest, laid the foundation for modern Mexican identity. The fall of the Mexica Empire brought sweeping changes to the economic structure of central Mexico. Under Mexica rule, the economy had been based on a complex tribute system, in which conquered cities and regions sent goods, food, and labor to Tenochtitlan. This system ensured a steady flow of resources to the capital, supporting the ruling elite, the military, and the religious institutions. However, with the arrival of the Spaniards, this tribute economy was dismantled and replaced with a colonial system that prioritized the extraction of wealth for Spain. One of the first economic changes was the introduction of the encomienda system. Under this system, Spanish settlers were granted control over indigenous communities with the supposed responsibility of protecting them and converting them to Christianity. In return, the indigenous people were forced to provide labor and pay tribute in the form of gold, agricultural goods, or other valuable resources. While the encomienda was justified as a means of Christianization, in practice, it functioned as a form of forced labor, often leading to the exploitation and suffering of the indigenous population. Mining became a central pillar of the new colonial economy. The Spaniards quickly identified the rich silver deposits in regions such as Zacatecas and Guanajuato, and they established large-scale mining operations. Indigenous laborers, often conscripted under the mita system, a remnant of pre-Columbian labor obligations, were forced to work in dangerous conditions. The silver extracted from these mines would fuel Spain's economy for centuries, financing its wars and expanding its global influence. Agriculture also underwent significant changes. The Spaniards introduced new crops such as wheat, barley, and sugarcane, which gradually replaced traditional Mesoamerican staples like maize and amaranth. Livestock, including cattle, pigs, and sheep, were brought to the region for the first time, altering the landscape and food production. Large estates, known as haciendas, were established to cultivate these new crops and raise European livestock. These estates became the foundation of the colonial economy, concentrating land and wealth in the hands of Spanish elites while reducing indigenous communities to tenant farmers or laborers.
Trade networks were also restructured to serve Spanish interests. The bustling markets of Tenochtitlan, once centers of regional commerce, were redirected to serve the needs of the colonial administration. Goods were now funneled towards Spain rather than circulating within Mesoamerica. The introduction of European currency further disrupted traditional economic practices, as indigenous communities were forced to participate in a monetized economy that often worked against their interests. These economic transformations reshaped the lives of millions. The Mexica, once the rulers of a vast tribute empire, found themselves at the bottom of a new social and economic hierarchy. The wealth of the land, once used to sustain their civilization, now flowed to the Spanish crown, fueling the rise of a colonial empire that would dominate the region for centuries. The Spanish conquest of the Mexica Empire was not solely a matter of superior firepower or disease, it was also a triumph of military strategy. Cortés and his men, though vastly outnumbered, employed a combination of European warfare tactics and local knowledge to outmaneuver the Mexica forces. One of their most effective strategies was the use of cavalry. The Mexica had never encountered horses in battle before, and the sight of mounted soldiers charging into combat caused confusion and fear. Spanish horses, larger and stronger than any native animals, allowed the riders to move quickly across the battlefield, striking at key points before retreating. The Mexica, accustomed to fighting on foot with macuacuitl swords and wooden shields, struggled to counter this new form of warfare. Another crucial element was the integration of native allies into the Spanish military structure. Cortés understood that he could not defeat the Mexica alone, and he leveraged the resentment of the empire's subject peoples to his advantage. The Tlaxcalans, who had long resisted Mexica rule, provided thousands of warriors who fought alongside the Spaniards. These allies were not merely auxiliaries, they played a central role in battles, using their knowledge of the terrain and local tactics to support the Spanish forces. The Spaniards also trained their allies in the use of European weapons, such as crossbows and steel swords, giving them an edge in combat. The use of siege warfare was another key factor in the Spanish victory. When Cortés returned to Tenochtitlan in 1521, he did not attempt to storm the city directly. Instead, he established a blockade, cutting off food and supplies while launching attacks from newly constructed brigantines, small ships built in Tlaxcala and transported to Lake Texcoco. These ships, equipped with cannons, allowed the Spaniards to control the waterways and bombard the city from multiple directions. The Mexica, who had relied on their island location as a defensive advantage, found themselves trapped. The combination of starvation, disease, and constant attacks weakened their resistance, making it easier for the Spaniards to breach their defenses. Finally, the Spaniards made effective use of psychological tactics to demoralize their enemies. Cortés and his men understood the importance of perception in warfare. They used their armor, horses, and firearms to create an image of invincibility. They also spread rumors that their weapons were divinely powered, reinforcing the belief that they were not ordinary men, but something more. The Mexica, already shaken by omens and the death of their emperor, found themselves facing an enemy that seemed unstoppable. These psychological factors, combined with superior military organization and strategy, played a decisive role in the fall of Tenochtitlan. With the Mexica Empire crushed, the Spaniards faced the challenge of governing a vast and diverse territory. Cortés, though victorious, was not the sole authority in the region. The Spanish crown had sent other expeditions, and rival factions within the colonial administration sought control over the newly conquered lands. In 1522, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, established the Royal Audiencia, a governing body meant to oversee the administration of New Spain. This move was partly intended to curb Cortés's growing power, as the Spanish crown feared that he might attempt to establish an independent rule. Cortés was officially named governor and captain general of New Spain in 1522, but his authority was soon challenged. The Royal Audiencia, composed of officials appointed by the crown, sought to limit his influence. Tensions between Cortés and the new administrators led to political conflicts, and in 1526, Cortés was stripped of his governorship. Though he remained a powerful figure, his role in the governance of Mexico diminished over time. The Spanish crown preferred a centralized system of rule, and in 1535, it established the Viceroyalty of New Spain, appointing Antonio de Mendoza as the first viceroy. This marked the beginning of a more structured colonial administration, with the viceroy acting as the direct representative of the Spanish monarch. Under Spanish rule, the political structure of Mesoamerica was transformed. The former Mexica provinces were reorganized into encomiendas, vast land grants given to Spanish settlers who were responsible for the indigenous population within their jurisdiction. These encomenderos collected tribute and labor from the native people, often exploiting them for economic gain. The indigenous nobility, once the ruling class of the Mexica Empire, was replaced by Spanish officials and landowners.
However, the Spaniards did not entirely dismantle the existing administrative framework. They retained elements of the Mexica bureaucracy, using indigenous officials to manage local affairs under Spanish supervision. The legal system also underwent significant changes. Spanish law replaced the traditional Mexica judicial system, and indigenous communities were subjected to the authority of Spanish courts. Laws were enacted to regulate land ownership, labor, and taxation, all of which favored the Spanish elite. The indigenous population, once the rulers of a mighty empire, found themselves at the bottom of a new social hierarchy. Resistance to Spanish rule persisted in some regions, but the Mexica, now leaderless and weakened by war and disease, could not mount a successful challenge. The political landscape of Mesoamerica had been irrevocably altered, setting the stage for centuries of colonial rule. The fall of the Mexican Empire did not mark the end of indigenous resistance, nor did it erase the deep-rooted traditions of the native peoples. While the Spaniards imposed their rule, they could not fully erase the cultural and social fabric of the indigenous societies. Over time, a new hybrid identity emerged, shaped by both Spanish and indigenous influences. This transformation was not immediate, nor was it uniform across the region. Different indigenous groups adapted in different ways, some resisting Spanish rule for decades, others finding ways to survive within the colonial system. One of the most significant long-term effects was the decline of indigenous population centers.
The diseases brought by the Spaniards, particularly smallpox, measles, and typhus, devastated the native population. In some regions, entire communities were wiped out within a few years. The survivors were often forced into labor systems, such as the encomienda and later the repartimiento, which bound them to Spanish landowners or mines. These systems, though officially meant to protect the indigenous peoples, often led to harsh conditions and exploitation. The population of central Mexico, which had numbered in millions before the conquest, dropped drastically, with some estimates suggesting a decline of over 80% in the following century. Despite these hardships, indigenous communities found ways to preserve their heritage. In rural areas, traditional farming practices continued, and many indigenous languages, including Nahuatl, Mixtec, and Zapotec, survived. The oral traditions, songs, and stories of the past were passed down through generations, ensuring that the memory of the Mexica and other civilizations endured. Some indigenous leaders, particularly those who had allied with the Spaniards, managed to retain a degree of power within the colonial system. The descendants of these leaders often held positions of influence in local governance, serving as intermediaries between the Spanish authorities and their own people. Religious syncretism also played a crucial role in cultural survival. While the Spaniards sought to replace indigenous beliefs with Christianity, many native communities blended their traditional practices with Catholicism. The veneration of saints often mirrored the worship of pre-Columbian deities, and festivals retained elements of ancient rituals. The Virgin of Guadalupe, for example, became a powerful symbol that combined Catholic devotion with indigenous spirituality. This blending of traditions allowed indigenous culture to persist even as it was reshaped by colonial rule. The conquest of the Mexican Empire was not just a military victory. It was the beginning of a long and complex process of cultural transformation. The indigenous people of Mexico did not vanish, but they were forced to adapt to a new world order. Their resilience ensured that even under colonial rule, their traditions, languages, and identities endured. The fall of the Mexican Empire was not just a regional event, it had far-reaching consequences that reshaped the global balance of power. The riches extracted from the Americas, particularly the vast quantities of silver from Mexico's mines, fueled the expansion of the Spanish Empire and transformed the European economy. The influx of silver into Spain allowed the Spanish crown to finance its military campaigns across Europe and the world. The wealth of the New World helped fund the Habsburg dynasty's wars in the Netherlands, Germany, and beyond, shaping the course of European history. The conquest also marked the beginning of a new era of global trade. The Spanish established the Manila Galleon trade route, which connected the Americas to Asia. Silver from Mexico flowed to the Philippines, where it was exchanged for Chinese silk, porcelain, and spices. This trade network linked Europe, the Americas, and Asia in a way that had never been seen before, laying the foundation for the modern global economy. The demand for American silver in China was so great that it contributed to inflation in Europe and reshaped economic policies in both the East and the West. The conquest also had profound effects on the movement of people. The transatlantic slave trade expanded as European powers sought labor for their American colonies. With the indigenous population decimated by disease and forced labor, African slaves were brought to the Americas in increasing numbers. This forced migration altered the demographics of the New World, creating new societies that blended European, African, and indigenous cultures. The legacy of this movement can still be seen in the cultural diversity of modern Latin America.
Moreover, the conquest of Mexico inspired other European powers to seek their own empires in the Americas. The Portuguese expanded their holdings in Brazil, the English and French established colonies in North America, and the Dutch and the Danes joined the race for control of the New World. The competition for land, resources, and trade routes would define global politics for centuries to come. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not just the end of an empire, it was the beginning of a new world order.
Though the Mexica Empire fell, its legacy endured in ways that shaped the future of Mexico and the world. The ruins of Tenochtitlan, buried beneath the streets of modern Mexico City, still whisper the story of a once great civilization. The Templo Mayor, uncovered in the 20th century, revealed the grandeur of Mexico religious life, with its towering pyramids and intricate carvings. The artifacts recovered from its depths, obsidian blades, jade ornaments, and statues of gods, offer a glimpse into a world that was both brutal and beautiful. The Mexica language, Nahuatl, remains alive in the hearts and voices of millions. Though Spanish became the dominant language of Mexico, Nahuatl words have woven themselves into everyday speech. Words like chocolate, tomato, and coyote, all borrowed from Nahuatl, have spread across the globe, a quiet but lasting tribute to the Mexica influence. Even in modern Mexican culture, echoes of the Mexica past can be found in festivals, cuisine, and art. The Day of the Dead, with its vibrant altars and offerings, bears the imprint of pre-Columbian traditions, blending indigenous beliefs with Catholic customs. The Mexica also left behind a written record, though much of it was destroyed by the Spaniards. Surviving codices, such as the Codex Mendoza and the Florentine Codex, provide invaluable insights into Mexica's society, history, and worldview. These manuscripts, filled with pictographs and symbols, tell the story of a people who saw themselves as chosen by the gods, bound by duty to maintain the cosmic order. The Mexica believed that the sun needed human blood to rise each day, a belief that shaped their rituals and justified their conquests. The fall of Moctezuma and the Mexica Empire offers a cautionary tale about the consequences of fear, misjudgment, and the clash of civilizations. Moctezuma's hesitation in the face of the Spaniards, his belief that they might be gods, and his failure to act decisively all played a role in the empire's downfall. His decision to welcome Cortés into Tenochtitlan, rather than resist, allowed the Spaniards to seize control and manipulate the political structure of the Mexica. This moment of indecision, born of both religious belief and political uncertainty, had irreversible consequences. Yet Moctezuma's story is not simply one of personal failure. It is also a reflection of the broader forces at play: prophecy, diplomacy, and the fragile balance of power in Mesoamerica. The Mexica Empire, though mighty, was not invincible. It relied on a system of tribute and military dominance that left many of its subjects resentful and eager for change. The Spaniards, though few in number, understood how to exploit these divisions, forging alliances with the Mexica's enemies and turning the empire's weaknesses into their own advantage. The conquest also highlights the devastating impact of disease, technology, and psychological warfare. The Spaniards did not win solely through military might. They used a combination of tactics, superior weapons, strategic alliances, and the spread of disease to break the Mexica resistance. The psychological effects of their arrival, the fear of the unknown, and the sudden collapse of leadership all contributed to the rapid fall of Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma's fate serves as a reminder of how quickly power can shift, how fragile empires can be, and how history is shaped by both individual choices and larger historical forces. His story is not just of defeat, but of the complex interplay between belief, politics, and the unpredictable nature of conquest. The lessons of his fall remain relevant, offering insight into the dangers of uncertainty, the power of perception, and the consequences of failing to adapt in the face of change. Historians continued to debate the true nature of Moctezuma's actions and the reasons behind his decisions. Some argue that he was a ruler paralyzed by fear, convinced that the Spaniards were divine beings destined to fulfill an ancient prophecy. Others suggest that he was a shrewd politician, attempting to navigate a complex and unprecedented situation with diplomacy rather than war. The truth, as with many historical figures, lies somewhere in between. One of the central questions historians grapple with is whether Moctezuma truly believed the Spaniards were gods or whether he used religious belief as a political tool. The Mexica had a long tradition of incorporating foreign deities into their pantheon, and Moctezuma may have seen the Spaniards as messengers of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god who was said to return from the east. However, some scholars argue that this belief was a later invention, created by Spanish chroniclers to justify their conquest. They point out that Moctezuma was a pragmatic ruler who had expanded the Mexica Empire through war and diplomacy. It seems unlikely that he would surrender his kingdom without resistance, unless he had a strategic reason for doing so.
Another point of contention is the role of Spanish chroniclers in shaping the narrative of Moctezuma's downfall. The primary sources about his life and death come from Spanish accounts, such as those of Bernal Díaz del Castillo and Hernán Cortés himself. These accounts, written years after the events, often portray Moctezuma as weak and indecisive, reinforcing the idea that the Mexica were destined to fall to European rule. However, indigenous sources, such as the Florentine Codex, compiled by the Franciscan missionary Bernardino de Sahagún, offer a different perspective. These accounts suggest that Moctezuma was not a passive victim, but a leader caught in an impossible situation, trying to maintain control in the face of an unprecedented crisis. Modern scholars also examine the broader geopolitical context of the conquest. The Mexica Empire, though powerful, was built on a fragile system of tribute and military dominance. Many of the conquered peoples resented Mexica rule and saw the Spaniards as an opportunity to overthrow their oppressors. Moctezuma may have understood this instability and sought to prevent rebellion by maintaining control through diplomacy rather than force. If this was his strategy, it ultimately failed, as the Mexican nobility and military lost faith in him, leading to his downfall. The debate over Moctezuma's legacy continues, with historians weighing the available evidence and reinterpreting the events of 1519 to 1520. Was he a ruler who hesitated at the wrong moment, or was he a leader trying to navigate a situation beyond his control? The answer remains elusive, but the discussion itself highlights the complexity of history and the many factors that shape the rise and fall of empires. While much of history focuses on Moctezuma, Cortés, and the great battles of the conquest, the true story of the fall of the Mexica Empire is also one of countless individuals whose lives were changed forever. Among them were the warriors who fought and died in the streets of Tenochtitlan, the priests who continued to offer sacrifices even as their temples were torn down, and the common people who struggled to survive amid war, disease, and displacement. These individuals, though often overlooked, played a vital role in shaping the course of history. One such figure was Tlalcatatzin, a Mexican noble who was captured by the Spaniards and later accompanied Cortés on his return to Spain. Unlike Moctezuma, who was seen as a defeated ruler, Tlalcatatzin was presented to the Spanish court as a symbol of the New World's wonders. He was given gifts, baptized, and paraded through the streets of Seville. Yet despite the royal treatment, he was never truly free. Records suggest he died within a year of his arrival in Spain, likely from disease or the harsh conditions of his forced journey. His story, like that of many indigenous people taken to Europe, is one of curiosity and exploitation, a reminder that the conquest was not only a battle of empires, but also a struggle for individual survival. Another forgotten figure was Xochitl, a Mexican healer who lived through the fall of Tenochtitlan. With the city in ruins and disease spreading rapidly, she and other healers worked tirelessly to care for the sick using traditional remedies passed down through generations.
When the Spaniards arrived, they dismissed her knowledge as primitive, yet some of her herbal treatments were later adopted by European physicians. Her contributions, like those of many indigenous medical practitioners, were rarely acknowledged in the historical record, but they played a crucial role in sustaining the population during one of the darkest periods in Mesoamerican history. There were also those who resisted in ways that did not involve weapons. Some Mexica families fled the city before its final fall, seeking refuge in the mountains or remote villages. Others, like the descendants of Moctezuma, tried to preserve their heritage by passing down stories, songs, and traditions in secret. These quiet acts of defiance ensured that the Mexica culture did not vanish entirely, even as their empire crumbled. The conquest was not just a clash of rulers and armies, it was a human story, filled with courage, suffering, and resilience. The lives of these lesser-known figures remind us that history is not shaped by kings and generals, but also by those who endured the consequences of their decisions. One of the most enduring mysteries surrounding Moctezuma's death is the question of his final words. According to Spanish accounts, as he lay dying from the wounds inflicted by his own people, he spoke to Hernán Cortés. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, a Spanish soldier who was present during the conquest, wrote that Moctezuma expressed regret for his actions, claiming that he had been deceived by his advisors. He reportedly told Cortés, "I am not angry at you, for I know that it was by your fate and that of your God that I have lost my empire." However, indigenous sources offer a different perspective. The Florentine Codex, compiled by the Franciscan missionary Bernardino de Sahagún, records a different version of Moctezuma's last words. In this account, Moctezuma does not express remorse or submission. Instead, he warns the Spaniards that they have brought themselves to destruction. He tells them that their greed and violence will not go unpunished, and that the gods will one day avenge the suffering they have caused. Which version is true? It is impossible to know for certain. The Spanish chroniclers had their own biases, seeking to justify their conquest and portray Moctezuma as a misguided ruler who failed to understand his own destiny. At the same time, the indigenous accounts, recorded long after the event, may have been shaped by the trauma of conquest and the desire to preserve the dignity of their fallen leader. What is clear is that Moctezuma's final moments were filled with pain, both physical and emotional. Whether he saw himself as a victim of fate or as a ruler who had failed his people, his death marked the end of an era. His words, whatever they were, remain a symbol of the tragedy that unfolded in Tenochtitlan, a city that once stood as the heart of an empire, now reduced to ruins. Though the Mexica Empire was destroyed, its influence continues to shape modern Mexico in ways both visible and unseen. The foundations of Mexico City, built atop the ruins of Tenochtitlan, stand as a testament to the city's Mexica past. The layout of the modern metropolis still follows the ancient canals and causeways that once connected the island capital. The Zocalo, the city's main square, occupies the space where the Templo Mayor once stood, and the remnants of that great temple can still be seen in the heart of the city. Beyond the physical remnants, the cultural legacy of the Mexica is woven into the fabric of Mexican identity. The national symbols of Mexico, the eagle perched on a cactus devouring a serpent, come directly from the Mexica founding myth. The Mexican flag bears these symbols, a direct link to the empire that once ruled the land. The Nahuatl language, though no longer dominant, continues to be spoken by hundreds of thousands of people, and many Nahuatl words remain in everyday use. The names of cities, rivers, and even food items such as chocolate, tamale, and avocado are all derived from the Mexica language. Mexican cuisine, too, owes much to the Mexica. Corn, beans, chili peppers, and tomatoes, all staples of the Mexica diet, remain central to modern Mexican cooking.
The techniques of nixtamalization, used to process corn into masa for tortillas, date back to the Mexica and continue to be used today. Even the traditional preparation of mole, a rich sauce made with chili peppers, chocolate, and spices, has roots in Mexica culinary traditions. The religious and spiritual traditions of the Mexica also endure in modern Mexican culture. The Day of the Dead, celebrated on November 1st and 2nd, blends Catholic and indigenous beliefs, reflecting the syncretism that emerged after the conquest. The reverence for the Virgin of Guadalupe, a figure venerated throughout Mexico, is closely tied to the Mexica devotion to the goddess Tonantzin. Pilgrimages to Tepeyac Hill, where the Virgin is said to have appeared, mirror the ancient Mexica pilgrimages to sacred mountains. In art, literature, and national consciousness, the Mexica remain a powerful symbol of Mexico's past. Murals depicting the glory of Tenochtitlan adorn government buildings, and historical novels and films continue to explore the story of Moctezuma and the fall of the empire. The Mexica are not just a memory of the past, they are a living part of Mexico's present, shaping its identity in ways that reach far beyond history books. The fall of Tenochtitlan did not mark the end of the Mexica people, but it did begin a long and painful transformation. In the years following the conquest, the surviving Mexica faced a world that had been turned upside down. The once proud warriors of the empire were now subjects of a foreign power, forced to adapt to a new way of life dictated by their conquerors. The transition was not immediate, nor was it uniform. Some Mexica resisted, retreating into the mountains and forests, determined to preserve their way of life. Others, seeing the futility of open rebellion, chose to survive within the colonial system, learning Spanish, adopting Catholicism, and working under the encomienda system that replaced the tribute structure of the Mexica Empire. Life under Spanish rule was harsh. The Mexica, once the rulers of a vast domain, were now at the bottom of a rigid social hierarchy. The encomienda system, which granted Spanish settlers control over indigenous labor, often led to brutal exploitation. Mexica farmers, once responsible for feeding their empire, were now forced to work the land for Spanish landowners, producing crops that would enrich the colonial elite rather than their own people. The introduction of European livestock, such as cattle and pigs, altered the landscape, and the Mexica, who had relied on chinampas, floating gardens for agriculture, found themselves displaced from their traditional lands. Education and religion became tools of control. The Spanish established schools to teach indigenous children in Spanish, hoping to erase their native language and customs. Missionaries worked to convert the Mexica to Christianity, destroying temples and replacing them with churches. Yet, despite these efforts, the Mexica found ways to preserve their identity. They continued to speak Nahuatl in secret, passed down their oral traditions, and incorporated their old beliefs into the new religion. The Virgin of Guadalupe, for example, became a powerful symbol that blended Catholic devotion with the Mexica reverence for the mother goddess Tonantzin. Pilgrimages to Tepeyac Hill, where the Virgin is said to have appeared, mirror the ancient Mexica pilgrimages to sacred mountains.
Over time, the Mexica identity merged with the broader indigenous and mestizo population of New Spain. Their descendants, though often forced into new roles, carried the legacy of their ancestors in their language, traditions, and resilience. The fall of Tenochtitlan had marked the end of the Mexica Empire, but it had not erased the people who had built it. Their struggle to survive and preserve their culture would continue for centuries, shaping the identity of modern Mexico in ways that still echo today. Historians continue to debate whether the fall of the Mexica Empire was an inevitable consequence of European expansion or a result of specific circumstances that could have been avoided. Some argue that the technological and military advantages of the Spaniards, superior weapons, horses, and steel, made the conquest all but certain. Others contend that the outcome was not predestined, that Moctezuma and his successors had opportunities to resist more effectively, and that the internal divisions of the Mexica Empire played a crucial role in its downfall. One of the strongest arguments for inevitability is the sheer scale of European colonial ambition. By the early 16th century, Spain was already engaged in the conquest of the Caribbean and parts of the Americas. The Spanish crown was eager to expand its wealth and influence, and the discovery of the Mexica Empire presented an opportunity too great to ignore. Even if Cortés had failed, another expedition would have eventually arrived, armed with the same weapons and driven by the same hunger for gold and land. The Mexica, despite their military prowess, were not prepared for sustained warfare against European powers with access to vast resources and global trade networks. However, counter-arguments suggest that the Mexica had the potential to resist more effectively. The empire was vast, with a powerful military and a sophisticated administrative system. If Moctezuma had acted decisively, if he had chosen to fight rather than negotiate, if he had rallied his allies instead of relying on diplomacy, the outcome might have been different. The Mexica had defeated powerful enemies before, including the Tlaxcalans and the Tarascans. With better leadership and a more unified response, they might have repelled the Spaniards, or at least prolonged the conflict long enough to force a different kind of settlement. The role of disease also remains a subject of debate. Smallpox and other European illnesses devastated the Mexica population, but some historians argue that the impact of disease has been overstated. While it undoubtedly weakened the Mexica resistance, it did not make their defeat absolute. The Spaniards still needed military victories, alliances, and strategic maneuvering to secure their control. Without these elements, disease alone might not have been enough to bring down the empire. Ultimately, the fall of the Mexica Empire was the result of a complex interplay of factors, military, political, and biological. Whether it was inevitable or not depends on how one weighs these elements. What is certain is that the conquest reshaped the world, setting the stage for centuries of colonial rule and the enduring struggle of indigenous peoples to preserve their heritage. Though the Mexica Empire fell, its story is far from over. The ruins of Tenochtitlan, the echoes of Nahuatl in everyday speech, and the traditions that persist in modern Mexico all speak to a civilization that refused to be erased. The Mexica were not just warriors and rulers. They were builders, artists, and philosophers who shaped the land they called home. Their legacy lives on in the streets of Mexico City, in the rituals of the Day of the Dead, and in the resilience of the people who carry their blood. The fall of Moctezuma was not just the end of a ruler, it was the end of an era. Yet, even in defeat, the Mexica left an indelible mark on history. Their story is a reminder of the fragility of power, the consequences of fear, and the enduring strength of culture. The conquest was a turning point, but it did not erase what came before. The Mexica, like the great city they built, remain a part of the world they helped shape. Their history is not just a tale of loss. It is a testament to survival, adaptation, and the unbreakable spirit of a people who, even in the face of destruction, refused to be forgotten.